The phone buzzed in the middle of the ICU. My husband glanced at the screen, smiled, then walked out of the room faster than any of the doctors had all week. In that moment, I was certain something terrible had happened. What I couldn't have imagined was what that smile actually meant. My name is Sarah Miller. I'm 34 years old. 5 years ago, my husband and I bought a neat two-story house in the suburbs of Chicago. The mortgage was intimidating, but the neighborhood made it feel worth it. It was one of those quiet, family-friendly places where kids rode their bikes until sunset. Neighbors dropped off homemade pies at Thanksgiving, and nearly every Sunday ended with someone hosting a backyard barbecue. From the outside, our life looked exactly like one of those insurance commercials that promise everything will be okay. My husband, Daniel, worked as a financial advisor. Order wasn't just part of his personality, it was who he was. His dress shirts were arranged in the closet by color. Bills were paid a week before they were due. Every tool in the garage had its own designated spot. Sometimes it drove me crazy. I was his complete opposite. I worked from home as an interior designer. I'd leave a coffee mug on a bookshelf without realizing it and spend hours sketching designs with music playing in the background. Daniel used to joke that if it weren't for him, I'd eventually lose my own car. We laughed about it. Back then, we still laughed. The center of our world was our 6-year-old son, Ethan. He was obsessed with dinosaurs. Every evening, he'd make us guess their names from pictures, even though he mixed up half of them himself. He was convinced that one day he'd become a paleontologist and discover a real Tyrannosaurus rex skeleton. Daniel always had the same answer. When you find it, we'll put it in the front yard. The neighbors will freak out. Good, let them be jealous. Ethan's laugh was so infectious that we couldn't help laughing with him. That's why the silence that settled over our lives just a few months later became almost unbearable. It started with a fever, 101 degrees. The pediatrician said it was probably just a virus. 3 days later, the fever still hadn't broken. Then the bruises appeared. They looked strange, as if someone had grabbed our son's arms hard enough to leave fingerprints. 2 days after that, Ethan stopped waking up with a smile. He just lay there, staring at the ceiling. I knew something was terribly wrong. I just didn't know what. Neither did anyone else. After countless blood tests and examinations, we were referred to Ann and Robert H. Lurie Children's Hospital in downtown Chicago. I can still remember the smell of that floor, antiseptic, burnt coffee from the vending machine, plastic waiting room chairs, and the endless chorus of medical monitors beeping in the background. The doctor walked in carrying a folder. He took off his glasses. That's never a good sign. We're going to need to run some additional tests. I barely heard another word. My ears were ringing. Daniel squeezed my hand tighter. He seemed unbelievably calm. I think that's the only reason I managed to hold myself together. If he'd fallen apart, I would have shattered right alongside him. The days that followed blurred into one endless day. Morning, blood work, IV drips, doctors, night. Then it all started over again. We practically stopped going home. Instead, we took turns sleeping in the uncomfortable recliner beside Ethan's hospital bed. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and find Daniel sitting by the window, looking down at the parking lot, saying nothing. I thought he was grieving in his own way. Why would I have imagined anything else? On the 4th day, one of the doctors told us Ethan's condition was deteriorating faster than they'd expected. He needed immediate treatment. Treatment that would be incredibly expensive, even with insurance. I stared silently at the estimates. Daniel reached for them before I could. "Don't worry," he said. "We'll figure it out." That was his favorite phrase. "We'll figure it out." Most of the time, we actually did. Just not this time. 2 days later, I noticed something that felt off. Daniel had started leaving Ethan's room more often. Sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for nearly an hour. "Where are you going?" "Work." "Now?" "My clients don't know our lives have been put on hold." I didn't argue. We needed the money. I understood. Or at least I thought I did. Then the phone calls started. He never answered them in front of me. He always stepped into the hallway. Sometimes he even went outside. Whenever he came back, he looked like he just sprinted several blocks. Everything okay? Of course. Did something happen? No. Then he changed the subject immediately. Any wife probably would have noticed, but when your child is lying in a hospital bed with IV lines running into his arms, you stop noticing almost everything, except the numbers on the monitor. That evening I went home for the first time in days. I needed clothes, phone chargers, some paperwork. The house greeted me with an unsettling silence. Daniel's coffee mug was still sitting on the kitchen counter, exactly where he'd left it a week earlier. Without thinking, I started cleaning. It was the only way to keep my mind occupied. Then I opened the washing machine. Inside was one of Daniel's light blue dress shirts. There was foundation on the collar. I froze. And no, my first thought wasn't what you're probably thinking. My younger sister Emily had hugged him the morning we rushed Ethan to the hospital. She always wore full coverage makeup. It had to be from that. I came up with an excuse for him, almost instantly. I tossed the shirt back into the washer, closed the lid, and tried to forget I'd ever seen it. Or at least convince myself I had. The next day, Emily came to the hospital. She brought homemade soup, sat beside me, wrapped me in a hug. You haven't been eating. I can't. She rubbed my shoulder gently, but she barely looked me in the eye. More than once, I caught her glancing at Daniel. He avoided looking at her too. I noticed. Then I invented another explanation. Everyone was uncomfortable. Everyone was scared. That had to be it, didn't it? That evening, Emily left. Daniel walked her out to the parking garage. He was gone for 20 minutes. Too long. When he came back, I asked, "Everything okay?" She was crying. About Ethan? Of course. The answer came a little too quickly, but I let it go, because at that exact moment, Ethan's fever spiked again. The next 48 hours passed in a haze. The doctors switched medications, the nurses came in every 30 minutes. I counted every breath my son took. Daniel was almost always by our side, which made me feel ridiculous for ever doubting him. What kind of man cheats on his wife while his child is fighting for his life? That doesn't happen, does it? On the 7th day, something happened that I'll never forget. We were sitting beside Ethan's bed. He'd finally fallen asleep. The monitors hummed softly. Rain began tapping against the windows. Then Daniel's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen. His expression changed. Only for a second, but I saw it. He smiled. Not a big smile, not a happy one. It was the kind of smile someone gives after receiving the message they've been desperately waiting for. Then he locked the screen, stood up. I need to step out. Right now? It's important. What happened? I'll be back soon. He was out the door before I could say another word. I watched him through the glass as he answered the call almost immediately. The conversation lasted less than a minute. Then he headed straight for the elevators. Not toward the coffee machine, not toward the restroom. Downstairs. About 10 minutes later, one of the nurses walked in. Has your husband already left? Yes. That's strange. Why? She hesitated. Never mind. No, wait. She instantly looked like she regretted saying anything. It's just, I thought I saw him here last night, with another woman. Something inside me snapped. What woman? I don't know, maybe a relative? She was wearing a dark coat, tall, blonde. They were talking by the elevators. I nodded, forced a smile. But for the first time, real suspicion took root inside me. The only problem was, it was aimed at the wrong person. The person who was truly destroying my life hadn't even crossed my mind yet. I barely slept that night. Not because the monitors beside Ethan's bed kept sounding their endless alarms. Not because nurses came in every 30 minutes to check his vitals. But because one careless comment kept replaying in my head. I saw your husband with another woman. It could have meant nothing. Hospitals are places where people are constantly crossing paths. Maybe she was a co-worker. Maybe she was another patient's relative. Maybe the nurse had simply mistaken him for someone else. I told myself that over and over. But once doubt finds its way into your heart, it doesn't leave just because you ask it to. Daniel came back about 40 minutes later. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee. He smiled with the same calm expression he always wore. "Double latte," he said, handing one to me. "Your favorite." I accepted it automatically. "Thanks." He looked over at Ethan, gently brushed our son's hair back from his forehead, then settled into the chair beside the bed, as if nothing unusual had happened. I wanted to ask him, "Where were you?" The words never came. What if the nurse had been wrong? What if I accused the man who'd barely left our son's side for an entire week? So I stayed quiet. But for the first time in our 10 years of marriage, I caught myself watching my own husband, really watching him. He checked his phone constantly, more often it seemed than the doctors checked Ethan's chart. Every time the screen lit up, it was only for a second before he flipped the phone face down. A week earlier, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. Now I noticed every movement, every glance, every sigh. The following morning, Ethan's doctor told us the latest test results had been delayed. Another day of waiting, another day of uncertainty, another day of fear. Daniel said he was going home to shower and grab clean clothes. "I'll be back in an hour, tops." I nodded. The second he left, I remembered I'd forgotten my laptop at home. I needed it anyway. I called a cab. For some reason, I didn't text Daniel to let him know. I wasn't even sure why. The drive home took about 40 minutes. As soon as we turned onto our street, I spotted Daniel's car parked in front of the garage. So he really had come home. Relief washed over me. I actually felt guilty for doubting him. When I unlocked the front door, I heard the shower running upstairs. He really was in the bathroom. Quietly, I headed upstairs. I grabbed my laptop. Then I figured I'd pack a few more things for Ethan. When I opened Daniel's closet to grab a gym bag, a small paper shopping bag tumbled off the top shelf. A velvet jewelry box slipped out. My heart skipped. Jewelry? Carefully, I lifted the lid. Inside was an elegant silver necklace with a tiny diamond. I stared at it. My birthday had been 5 months ago. Our anniversary wasn't for another 3. Christmas was still a long way off. So, who was it for? Almost instantly, I came up with an explanation. Maybe he'd bought my gift early. Planning ahead was exactly the kind of thing Daniel would do. I put the box back. Then I noticed the receipt. Purchased 3 days ago. The same day Ethan was admitted to the ICU. Something tightened in my chest. No, there had to be an explanation. There had to be. I was just about to close the bag when I heard footsteps. I shoved everything back where I'd found it. A few seconds later, Daniel walked into the bedroom. His hair was still damp. He smiled. "I didn't expect to see you here. I forgot my laptop. You could have called. I didn't want to interrupt you." His eyes flickered toward the open closet. Just for a fraction of a second, but I caught it. "Looking for something?" "A bag. It's downstairs." The answer came too fast, almost as though he already knew what I was supposed to be looking for. The drive back to the hospital was nearly silent. Daniel turned on the radio. I stared out the window. We were both lost in our own thoughts. But only one of us seemed to be hiding something. Or was I imagining all of it? When we got back, Ethan's doctor was waiting for us. His condition had worsened again. He needed another procedure. There wasn't time to wait. The preparations took nearly an hour. Every suspicion I'd been nursing vanished in an instant. All that remained was fear. When they wheeled Ethan away, I broke down for the first time all week. Not quiet tears, not holding back. I sobbed. Daniel wrapped his arms around me, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe. "He's going to make it." I cried into his shoulder. And in that moment, I believed him again. How could someone who held me like that be living a double life? It couldn't be possible, could it? Hours later, the procedure was over. Ethan was still unconscious. The doctor told us all we could do now was wait. So we waited. Out in the hallway sat the elderly woman I'd seen almost every day since we'd arrived. She always had knitting in her lap. She never seemed to be in a hurry. Sometimes we'd exchange a few polite words. This time, she spoke first. "Your husband seems very devoted." I smiled. "He is." She nodded thoughtfully. "Though he looks exhausted lately." "We both are." "I'm sure." She fell silent for a moment. "Yesterday, I happened to see him at the cafe across the street." I looked up. "Across the street?" "Yes." "He was talking to a young, blonde woman." My smile disappeared. A blonde. Again. Another woman. And once again, it wasn't me. The woman continued. "She looked like she'd been crying. And your husband kept looking over his shoulder, as if he was afraid someone might see them." A chill ran through me. I didn't even realize how tightly I was gripping my coffee cup until the plastic lid cracked beneath my fingers. Hot coffee spilled across my hand. I barely felt it. That evening, I decided to check something. While Daniel stayed with Ethan, I pulled out my phone and opened our banking app. We shared a joint account. I almost never looked at it. Daniel handled all of our finances. I scrolled through the recent transactions. Groceries, pharmacy, gas station, hospital parking. Everything looked normal. Until one payment caught my eye. A luxury jewelry boutique. The exact amount listed on the receipt I'd found. I stared at it for several minutes. Then I noticed another charge. A restaurant in downtown Chicago, 2 nights earlier. Dinner service, $280. I frowned. We'd been living at the hospital, practically around the clock. So how had he managed to have dinner downtown? A business meeting? Maybe. But why now? Why when our son was fighting for his life? I closed the app. At that exact moment, Daniel walked over. "What are you looking at?" I locked my phone immediately. "Just the news." He looked straight into my eyes, too intently, as if he were trying to decide whether I believed my own lie. Late that night, he stood up again. "I need to step out for a few minutes." This time, I already knew what I'd say. "Okay." He left. I counted to 60, then quietly got up and followed him. My heart was pounding so hard it felt loud enough for the whole floor to hear. I watched him step into an elevator. The doors were almost closed. I managed to catch the next one. When I reached the lobby, he was gone. Then, a few seconds later, I spotted him near the hospital's main entrance. He crossed the parking lot quickly. I kept my distance. The rain had grown heavier. Hardly anyone was outside. Daniel stopped beside a black SUV. A woman stepped out. Tall, blonde, dark coat. The same woman. I ducked behind a concrete pillar. They started talking. She looked upset. Daniel shook his head several times. Then, unexpectedly, he reached out and took both of her hands. Something inside me broke. I wanted to run toward them, to scream, to demand an explanation. Instead, I couldn't move. A minute later, something happened that made even less sense. The woman reached into her handbag and pulled out a thick brown envelope. She handed it to Daniel. He slipped it beneath his jacket without hesitation. Then he looked around. For one terrifying second, I thought he was looking directly at me. I crouched lower behind the pillar. When I looked again, the SUV was already pulling away. Daniel stood alone in the rain. For several seconds, he simply watched the taillights disappear into the night. Then he took a deep breath and slowly walked back toward the hospital. I made it to Ethan's room before he did. I sat beside my son's bed and pretended to read one of the medical brochures lying on the table. A minute later, Daniel walked in. Calm, collected, exactly as always. "Everything okay?" "Of course." He sat beside me. My eyes drifted to his jacket. The envelope was gone. Where had he hidden it? And more importantly, what had been inside that envelope? Cash, documents, or proof that everything I'd believed about my marriage had been a lie? I didn't sleep at all that night. The same images kept replaying in my mind. The black SUV, the blonde woman, the brown envelope, Daniel holding her hands. Anyone in my position would have come to the same conclusion. I'd already reached it. My husband was having an affair. And he was doing it while our son was fighting for his life. I hated myself for not being able to stop thinking about it. Then I hated myself even more for something else, for being capable of doubting the man who spent every night beside our child's hospital bed. The next morning, I woke to the sound of the doctor's voice. "We've got some good news." I shot upright. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was smiling. "Ethan's body is finally responding to the treatment." He paused. "This isn't the finish line, but it's the first real step in the right direction." I burst into tears, not from grief, from relief. Daniel wrapped his arms around me. I could feel his hands trembling. He was crying too, quietly, trying not to let anyone see. For a moment, I almost believed I'd been wrong about everything. Then, an hour later, everything changed again. "I just need to step out for 15 minutes, Daniel said. This time, I wasn't going to sit there wondering. The moment the door closed behind him, I reached for the overnight bag beside his chair. A week ago, the thought would have horrified me. Now, my conscience was silent. Inside were folders, his laptop, a charger, paperwork, and the same brown envelope I'd seen the night before. My hands shook so badly I could barely open it. I expected photographs, love letters, hotel receipts, anything that would confirm what I'd convinced myself was true. Instead, I found bank documents, loan applications, paperwork showing the sale of his investment account, forms authorizing the early withdrawal of his retirement savings, documents for a second mortgage against our home. None of it made sense. Why? Why would he hide this from me? One final page slipped onto the floor. It was a letter. For payment of an experimental treatment program. I read the sentence again and again. Experimental treatment? No one had mentioned an experimental treatment. Just then, I heard a voice behind me. "So, you found it." I spun around. Daniel was standing in the doorway. He didn't look angry. If anything, he looked exhausted. More exhausted than I'd ever seen him. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had been burning inside me. "Who is she?" He lowered his eyes. "You saw us?" I saw enough. He sank into a chair and buried his face in his hands. For the first time, he didn't even try to defend himself. I braced myself for a confession. Instead, I heard something I never expected. "Her name is Laura. She works for a charitable foundation." I said nothing. "The doctors found an experimental treatment program in Boston. Our insurance refused to cover it. The cost was just under $1 million. The room tilted. What? I started looking for every possible way to pay for it. I sold my investments. I emptied my retirement account. I took out a second mortgage on the house. And even then, it wasn't enough." His eyes drifted to the papers scattered across the bed. "Laura helps families raise money for treatments like this. She was trying to find sponsors. That's why we kept meeting." Part of me didn't believe him. Another part wanted desperately to. "Then why didn't you tell me?" He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I didn't want to give you false hope. If I couldn't raise the money, I wouldn't have been able to look you in the eye. I covered my face with my hands. The envelope, the paperwork, the phone calls. Then another thought struck me. I looked up. The necklace? For the first time in days, Daniel smiled. A tired smile. Laura bought it. It was for a charity auction. She asked me to pick it up. I felt the ground disappear beneath me. One by one, every accusation I'd built inside my head collapsed. But one question still remained. The restaurant? He nodded. I was meeting with potential donors. I drove there straight from the hospital. I stayed for 40 minutes. No one agreed to help. At that moment, the door opened. The blonde woman stepped inside. Tall, dark coat. The same woman I'd seen in the parking lot. Laura. She offered a tentative smile. I know this is probably the worst possible time. I just stared at her. She carried a folder. I wanted to tell you both in person. She laid it on the table between us. The funding has been secured. I blinked. What? This morning, an anonymous donor covered the remaining balance. The room fell completely silent. I looked at Daniel. He lowered his head. And for the first time all week, he cried openly. No hiding it, no holding it back. A few days later, Ethan was transferred to a specialized clinic in Boston. The treatment was brutal, recovery was slow. But it worked. 7 months later, our son was running through the backyard again, arguing with the neighborhood kids, teaching anyone who would listen about dinosaurs. We believed the worst was finally behind us. We were wrong. One evening, months later, Daniel and I were sitting on the front porch after Ethan had gone to bed. "I'm sorry," I said. He looked over at me. "For what?" "I was convinced you were cheating on me." He was silent for a long time. Finally, he said, "You had every reason to think that." I frowned. "Why?" He took a slow breath. Then he said something that shattered my world all over again. "Because I did betray you." My heart stopped. "What?" He kept staring out into the darkness. "Not with another woman. With you." I didn't understand. He continued. "While you stayed beside Ethan, I was signing loan papers, selling everything we'd spent 10 years building, putting our house up as collateral. I made every decision alone, without asking you. I wanted to save our son, but I took away your right to choose that sacrifice with me." I couldn't answer, because in that moment I understood something I hadn't seen before. He really had betrayed me, just not in the way I'd imagined. He hadn't betrayed our marriage. He'd betrayed our partnership. He decided that carrying the weight of our family's future was his burden alone, and it had nearly crushed him. I reached for his hand. If we had to choose again, I'd still choose Ethan, even if it cost us our house, even if it cost us every dollar we had. But promise me something. Never make that choice alone again. He nodded, without saying a word. A year later, we were living in a small rental house. We'd had to sell our home. Financially, we were starting over from scratch. But for the first time in a very long while, we were completely honest with each other. People often think betrayal always looks the same. Another woman, another man, another secret life. The truth is, betrayal wears many faces. Sometimes it's born from selfishness, sometimes from fear, and sometimes from love. Those are the hardest betrayals to recognize. When I think back to that week in the hospital, what hurts most isn't that I suspected my husband. It's that we both chose to suffer in silence. He stayed silent because he couldn't bear to destroy my hope. I stayed silent because I was terrified of destroying our family. It wasn't until the truth was finally spoken aloud that we truly became a family again. Now, every time Ethan runs into the backyard, waving another dinosaur book and shouts, "Mom, look, I found a new species!" I'm reminded of what really matters. You can buy another house. You can earn back every dollar you've lost. Even broken trust can be rebuilt. But the chance to look your child in the eyes each morning and say, "Good morning, buddy," that's priceless. And sometimes it's worth paying everything you have.